Please let me know in the chat if that's not the case. We're gathering here today, both virtually and in Puebla, for the panel Transpositions, History and the Mediated Subject. Professor Hayes will join us soon, so I suggest we start with the presentation of Dr. Aidan Erasmus. Ah, she is here. Professor Hayes, you are just here, I gather. I'll let you go first, of course, and introduce you to our audience. So Patricia Hayes is a chair in visual history and history and theory at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. She holds a PhD focusing on visual history from the University of Cambridge, and she specializes in visual history, African history. She is also part of a movement to promote the preservation and activation of archives, where the archive becomes part of a methodological and philosophical thinking. Today, Professor Hayes will speak about group photo with Mandume yaNdemufayo, the lacunary function of photographs, texts, and oral tradition across African history. Professor Hayes, if you would like to share a PowerPoint, you can do so by sharing your screen with us, and we'll see it here, as well as the participants at home will see your PowerPoint. If not, you can just start, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's
Oh,
visible.
we can. The guys in the backstage need to share it. I can see it on my laptop here, but you might be able to present it on presentation mode, so we see it a little bit bigger. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, hello everybody. Great pleasure to be with you. Thank you for this opportunity. So let me start by saying that against a backdrop of drought and severe famine, the crisis of 1915 for the Kwanyama Kingdom in southern Angola manifests for historians as a dramatic convergence of outright war with Portuguese expeditionary forces and colonial occupation by both Portugal and the Union of South Africa, resulting in the partition of this African kingdom. So all of what I'm talking about today is happening during World War I. Now, these different happenings point to a plurality of distinctive yet connected temporalities, whereas Siegfried Kracauer writes, each time has its own shape. Kracauer, I'm going to quote him again. He says, actually, history consists of events whose chronology tells us but little about their relationships and meanings. Since simultaneous events are more often than not intrinsically asynchronous, it makes no sense indeed to conceive of the historical process as a homogeneous flow. The image of that flow only veils the divergent times in which substantial sequences of historical events materialize. So we have divergent times, materializations of events. If we stay with Kracauer, he also wrote about photography, and he suggests that the photograph is the material deposit. And I quote, the residuum that history has discharged. He writes, I quote, photography grasps what is given as a spatial or temporal continuum. According to Mary Ann Duane, the only way to represent time was by cutting into it. I quote, slicing it in such a way that it could become representable. And Ernst van Alphen notes that, I quote, the graphic inscriptions made by light on the surface of the plate were indexical traces of these moments. Now, one such trace is a group portrait that was produced as part of what was known as the Tour to Ovamboland by Colonel Pritchard's expedition on behalf of the Union government of South Africa in September 1915. My colleague, who's also on this panel, Rui Assubuji, speaks of the strange characteristic of stopping for the camera that was an integral part of expeditionary progress in colonial Mozambique in the early 20th century, and where we find the actual procedures of their production remain rather mysterious. While it is so often the case that photographs constituted part of unofficial historical knowledge, to quote Elizabeth Edwards, the one I focus on here was produced and published in the official report to Parliament in Cape Town, along with several others. At one level, it is an utterly conventional photo, and most viewers today only register it as interesting because it includes this figure Mandume yaNdemufayo, of whom not many images exist, and he was the last king of this region, Kwanyama. As a widespread genre, there is a certain uniformity to such group photographs that makes them unremarkable, and their meaning seems clear. Yet, as Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer point out in their book, School Photos in Liquid Time, such group photos have a role to play in quietly, as they put it, advancing agendas of assimilation and exclusion. Imperial and national institutions have employed similar tactics to address heterogeneous populations in terms of inclusion and exclusion. The group photo is a genre that seemingly institutionalizes. Through the orderly lines or rows, the group photo, I'm quoting Hirsch and Spitzer, incorporates its subjects in a standardizing frame, lined up. Now, if this is the case, what standard are we touching on here? The Union government officials from South Africa produced several group photos. The first with Martin Kadikwa, who was the king of Ndonga, who you see seated here also next to Major Pritchard. Ndonga was the most southeastern polity, the first to be entered from the south. Subsequently, group photos were made with Mandume and his councillors, and also with different groups of Portuguese officers across the putative border and in the newly designated neutral zone between the two colonies of Angola and Southwest Africa. In most of these group photos, the Union officers appear alongside or in rows with these new acquaintances. These group photos are quite specific to this particular moment of World War I because it was when resources and diplomacy were committed to affixing the borders and securing arrangements for this new part of empire. Pritchard and his group also produced two rudimentary but important sketch maps. And I just want to include one here to indicate the proposed new dispensation, and you will see Angola to the north and the different polities that straddle Angola and what was German Southwest Africa and now being occupied by the Union of South Africa. Pritchard's group was seen as the senior advance guard of officials to the border area who would confirm existing diplomatic agreements with the Portuguese and broker new arrangements with African leaders and then hand over to native affairs officials. The group also came with the aura of the British, as the South Africans were called at this time, also the English, having defeated the German troops of General Franke in Southwest Africa a few weeks earlier. Now, the Colonel S.M. Pritchard, responsible for the expedition, was in fact the seasoned official Sydney Pritchard, previously the past commissioner in the Witwatersrand, at the center of an expanding web of labor recruitment, and the pass implementation system centered on the gold mines. Pritchard came with a certain confidence about folding new groups into this vast system. And Lieutenant Moroney, who is also in this picture, bottom right, put it very bluntly when he stated the purpose of Pritchard's expedition was, I quote, visiting certain Ovambo chiefs in the interest of native labor. But as Pritchard noted in his telegrams and later his report to Prime Minister Smuts, they realized that with the war going on across the border, this was a unique opportunity to effect a cheap and peaceful occupation of a sensitive border area. Now, of course, this group photo does not tell us all this, but it's coming, what I've been saying comes from cross-reference with other materials prompted by the presence of Pritchard in the image. The group portrait itself suggests something of fitting new African leaders into a vast schema of which Pritchard and his fellow officers are representatives. What is of great interest is the thickness of what Elizabeth Edwards calls this acted document. An instance of, again to borrow from Edwards, inscribed tableau of existence and experience that such photos frequently afford. Such expeditionary photos are often monumental, but they are highly specific and also silent about a great deal. Georges Didi Huberman refers to the latter, the silence, as lacunary, and argues that they have, in fact, an important function. They are like holes which are records of actions in themselves. And as Edwards very neatly puts it, I quote, "The photo has its limits, but it points us in certain directions." The photos put pressure on other sources, according to Edwards. So in contemplating this photographic image, one is forced to, as it were, rewind. One is driven back into other detailed accounts that might be available. We know from Pritchard's report that he met Mandume in the midst of fighting relatively close by. Besides Pritchard's own report, there are multiple accounts in the Rhenish Missionary Society archives that were authored by, amongst others, August Wolfhorst, who was expelled from his station at Omupanda later the same year. This German missionary took considerable trouble to draft several detailed narratives of the occupation of the region. He had also known Mandume since his childhood, weaving him into biographical writing about individual converts and their encounters with royal figures such as Mandume. But we should note that Wolfhorst wrote these longer accounts of the war from a distance of many years back in Germany. While their narrative is dramatic, these are retrospective, orderly accounts when at the time things were extremely violent and chaotic on the ground. But to go into one of these accounts, Wolfhorst speaks of how people initially thought they could hear thunder, but it was Portuguese cannon as heavy fighting began. So suddenly it brings across the sound of war. Mandume heard of the English arrival in Ondonga, and that's the phrasing of Wolfhorst. And this was presumably through messengers sent by his neighboring king, Martin Kadikwa. Mandume sent a gift of 20 to 30 cattle to the English and asked them to come and help against the Portuguese. People heard nothing for a few days, and Kwanyama forces were heavily engaged against the Portuguese, who were moving closer. A 3-day battle at Omongwa, on the edge of the kingdom, with heavy Portuguese artillery had commenced, when on Sunday, 29th August, Pritchard's party arrived in one mission station called Namakunde, very close to the border. And Wolfhorst rode there. He said there were many whites and that Southwest Africa was now British. The group, he reported, had come to see Ovamboland, not knowing about the war in the north, and also in response to Mandume's message. So Wolfhorst promised to come the next day and to bring Mandume. The British sent a car, but the king, Mandume, did not trust them and he rode to the meeting. As Wolfhorst put it, he thought they would take him off somewhere. Okay, now I'm going to just follow through with some of Wolfhorst's narrative. It began what he calls the wearisome negotiations, when Pritchard asked Mandume what he had done to make the Portuguese attack. The king said he had done nothing. And quoting Wolfhorst, they had killed his people and come with huge firepower to make war. He asked for help. He would rather give his land to the English than the Portuguese. It was his land. He could give it. They contradicted the sovereign claim, saying he could not do anything because of the border between Angola and Southwest Africa, which must be respected. And Wolfhorst wrote that it was very hard acting as a translator. He had to keep repeating and clarifying and say to Mandume, these are not my words, but what the whites say. And they returned for more negotiation the next morning, 2nd September. At this point, a message from the Portuguese Expeditionary Army under General Pereira de Essa was delivered, stating that Mandume had done many evil deeds. When informed that this must have its outcome, Mandume was apparently, in Wolfhorst's phrasing, knocked low. Talks continued, and the question now was what Mandume could do to not lose his land entirely. It was put to him that he could be under British protection if he moved to that part of his land that belonged to Southwest Africa, which is like the bottom third of the Kingdom of Kwanyama. He would not be able to rule freely. He would need to follow instructions from a commissioner. He could not kill his subjects nor punish without guidance from the commissioner. In brief, Wolfhorst wrote, he would shortly be a very dependent chief. And he commented, one can think how bitter a pill this was to swallow. At 4 p.m., the negotiations ended and Mandume was sent to inform his headman and ask whether they understood they would be under English protection. He went out, apparently very angry. Eventually, all parties agreed and the paper was drawn up by another missionary present called Hochstrata, which Mandume signed with a cross. The king and his advisors were again asked if anyone wanted to continue fighting the Portuguese or go with the agreement, and they assented. When the party arrived back in Omopanda, news came that the Portuguese were approaching very near. Wolfhorst then states that Mandume, already very sad, then sat and cried like a child. He saw that things were really in earnest. The king took a horse and went to his royal residence, the Mbala at Onjiva, and sent a message back to Wolfhorst that he was going to burn the capital in the morning. So as the smoke appeared on 3rd September, people started streaming south out of Portuguese territory into the, the lower part of the kingdom. Any remaining food stores were lost, and Wolfhorst estimates retrospectively that losses were huge. Perhaps 1/3 of the kingdom perished, he said, and Mandume's power was broken. Now, there's a very different oral account that was recorded in 1989 by a Lutheran pastor called Wilho Kaulinge, and he invests Mandume with a more confident persona during the negotiations with Pritchard. Kaulinge himself was 15 at the time of these events, and he was part of the royal household. The question of the border only emerges in his narrative once the Portuguese replied to the message sent by the English. Kaulinge then interpolates the point that some notion of the border had been imparted by someone called Kaluapa, who was a Swedish trader, Axel Ericsson, some years before. And according to this oral account, there actually was no border. And Kaulinge represents Mandume as saying that the putative border went right through his millet field. So in this account, the line cutting through a millet field called Mahangu might well stand as a metonym for a cutting into productivity, food security, and reproduction, indicating an endangerment to the body and the body politic. Now, this little phrase ascribed to Mandume carries implications of disturbance, dispossession, and destruction at the heart of things. Such a metonym is also quite discreet. Nowhere does Kaulinge speak of Mandume's body gestures like the German missionary Wolfhorst, where the king's display of strong emotions appears to match the seismic events related to the externally imposed fault line of the border. In Wolfhorst's several accounts, iterations around the border and Portuguese advances are echoed in the heavy emotions Mandume displayed as the news became worse and his losses increased. And he describes this loss of composure in diminishing terms that infantilize the king. So just like I quoted earlier, Mandume sat and cried like a child. Wolfhorst, however, acknowledges that he had grounds enough because his power was broken. Now, of course, in all of this, in the middle of this, these events, everyone had to stop the camera to make a group photo. It was probably taken on the day the headman agreed with Mandume to Pritchard's terms, and the king signed late on 2nd September 1915, though we do not know for sure because no document refers to the process. Another lacuna. Now, Mandume was moving each day between Onjiva, his capital, Omupanda, and Namakunde, and receiving news from the battlefield at Omongwa, where the forces continue to be engaged. His own arguments about sovereignty, his agitation, and the constant movement of messengers are in no way conveyed in the group photo with Pritchard. The camera required everything to stop. Ernst van Alphen points out that, I quote, only because the photographic image resists time, unlike cinema, it is able to store or represent it. Whereas time is usually seen as continuous, it can only be archived in its discontinuity. End of quote. But there is another discontinuity here, that of space, which is also literally cut up to make the border and only becomes legible through the lines made on a map. In these caesurae, we might miss the violence of what has been pushed out of the photo, namely Mandume's autonomy. To return to Krakow, the photographic image grasps everything that is present in, I quote, the spatial configuration of a moment. It includes all spatial elements in front of the camera. And the result is that it reveals nothing of a subject. And there's a famous quotation by Krakow that a person's history is buried as if under a layer of snow. However, one of Mandume's favorite hunting dogs was present in the group photo, and his open hands rest on its back as if in a familiar gesture. Royal hunting dogs had a privileged status in the region. There's some anthropology about this, and Pritchard's report also mentions 29 hunting dogs accompanied Mandume's party to the negotiations. So this is a group portrait of important men, but these minor hunting signifiers are germane for a number of reasons. In the stillness of the group photo, a suggestion of other kinds of dynamics and movement emerges. Hunting had its special codes that were widely observed, but they could be switched over very quickly to warfare. The skills of both were paramount in this environment. Mandume at times relied on the masking that hunting offered when his forays into expanding or rebuilding his authority needed to be disguised. John Berger suggests there is a coexistence of different visible orders. And I quote, "Our customary visible order is not the only one. Hunters are continually aware of it, and so can read signs we do not see. Interstices exist between these different sets of the visible." Continuing to quote Berger, "Dogs with their running legs, sharp noses, and developed memory for sounds are the natural frontier experts of these interstices. Their eyes are attuned both to the human order and to other visible orders." End of quote. The natural frontier experts of the interstices. Dogs tend to have their own movements, detached from the larger agenda, and they often stray into photographs. The presence of dogs appearing in the frame of the photograph is often a sign of contingency, suggesting a lack of capacity on the part of the photographer to fully control the scene. This highlights Edwards' point that, and I quote Elizabeth Edwards, "Photographs inscribe in both minute and granular detail and with random excess. They record more than the photographer ever intended." End of quote. It might prompt us to ask whether there is anything else besides the dog that has strayed into this group photo. And perhaps one answer might be the amulets around Mandume's extended wrists escaping his suited arms that attest to some of his own performative ambivalence here. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, I wanted to ask for applause indeed. Thank you, Professor Hayes, for this really lovely reading of that photograph. I suggest that we take some questions only now if they are really clarification questions. We otherwise proceed with the other presentations and then do the discussion afterwards. So unless there are really clarification questions, I suggest we go on. I'm looking at the people at home. Well, it doesn't seem to be the case, so I'm very happy to present our next speaker to you all. That is Dr. Aidan Erasmus. He completed his doctoral studies at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. This dissertation focused on constituting sound as a modality through which to think the resonant contours of imperial war. Dr. Erasmus has previously participated in global exchange programs with Sogang University in South Korea and was awarded writing fellowships at the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change at the University of Minnesota and the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. He is currently appointed as a contract lecturer in the Department of History at the University of the Western Cape, and today Dr. Erasmus will speak about grey matter, transposing print and radio. Dr. Erasmus, feel free to share your screen if you have a PowerPoint presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna see if I can, what happens if I do this. No. Just give me a minute. No.
We did see a presentation, just for your information.
Okay. It's not, did you see my notes at all? Was it the
We did
presenter
not
view
see your
or was
notes. It
okay,
was
then
just
let me do that.
a full slide.
Okay, then let me do that then. Okay, does everything look okay on your side?
Well, now we don't see your presentation.
Okay, let me just do it the easy way.
I think you still need to share your screen.
Okay, everyone can see that.
This is perfect.
If I do that, does anything change?
No, nothing changed.
Okay.
No.
Leave it like it is.
Perfect, and I'll just continue like this. Okay, thank you, everyone. Okay. So in keeping with the theme of this panel, which is on transpositions, history, and a mediated subject, this paper is interested in transposition specifically as a concept through which to think about the work of mediation in relation to history, time, its subjects, and the process of subject formation. I myself am broadly interested in the work of media and technology in the formation of specifically apartheid's warring subject through the senses in South Africa and beyond. This is also an interest that poses specific methodological questions for the historian, who must think about media and technology not merely as conduits for historical representation, but as figuring such representation through the historicity of such forms, and by extension, the historiography in which they are located and circulate. This paper thus asks two key questions. What historical work does transposition between media do? And what is the place of the senses and their mediation in such a transposition? So there are two objects of concern in this paper connected in ways that should become clear as we progress and that I will map out as a problem as we go forward. The first is a 1988-1989 dry point etching by the South African artist William Kentridge entitled Caspars Full of Love, which you should be able to see on your screen now. The artwork, which depicts a set of severed heads positioned on shelves in a cabinet-like crate, forms part of a group of works that featured a drawing, an encaustic painting, and a screen-printed banner, the latter which now hangs in the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg in South Africa, which you can see to the right on the slide. Alongside and below the shelf structure, the title Caspars Full of Love appears in cursive handwriting. A number of other inscriptions feature in the different impressions of the piece, some such as "not a step," and a quotation which reads, "Where are they all now? Smoke, ashes, fable, or perhaps they are no longer even fable." It is worth reflecting on the history of the piece itself for a moment. According to Kentridge, Caspars Full of Love is inspired by the works of the 12th century Italian painter and architect Giotto, encountered by the artist in Florence, and other crags such as Inverted Sugar Crop from 1986, which you should be able to see on your screen now. Some critics have remarked that the work represents the corporality of death under apartheid, and that the, quote, decapitated heads piled into a makeshift shelf cobbled together from what appears to be an upright standing coffin are metonymies and synecdoches of the corpse, end quote. In other places, it has been thought to refer to and form part of Kentridge's other filmic and animation work, noting that, quote, Kentridge's graphic images contribute to his depiction of time and space and become both reality and the subject of his films. We can see some of this resonance in the stills from the animated work, Johannesburg, second greatest city after Paris, that I've included on the slide as well. Oh, sorry. The artwork, whilst having multiple influences leading to its production that are somewhat visible when I note them, hides another thing that is a little less visible. This influence is in the supposed origin of the title, Caspars Full of Love, which, as we continue, proves to be the origin of the idea behind the work itself. This reveals the second object of interest in this paper. According to Kentridge, I'd had the title Caspars Full of Love in the back of my head for a year, trying to work on what the image would be to go with it. The full phrase of the title had come from a radio program I heard when South African troops were fighting on the borders and in the townships. There was a forces favorite in which mothers and fathers would send messages out to their sons in the army. One of the messages came from a mother who said, "We hope you got the food parcel. Looking forward to having you home for Christmas. This message comes from your mother with Caspars Full of Love." So the work had started off with drawings after Giotto and then became its own piece. As Kentridge notes, the title Caspars Full of Love is drawn from a radio dedication, what in common parlance would now be called a shout-out, on Forces Favorite, a popular South African radio program hosted on Springbok Radio from 1969 to 1989. Force's Favorites had two iterations, one on the South African Broadcasting Corporation, the SABC, on their English service hosted by Patricia Hayes, and an Afrikaans version of the same name presented by Esme Everard. Both versions were listened to both inside and outside of South Africa, specifically by white South African conscripts serving on the border of Angola and Namibia, and their families back home at the height of the Cold War. The message from which the artwork takes its title echoes a message from a mother to a son who was on that very border. A Casper, as referred to in the title, is a South African military personnel transport vehicle lauded for its landmine resistance and ambush protection qualities, and was used extensively in the policing of townships during the various states of emergency in South Africa, specifically in the 1980s. Pictured here in the left of the image is one that now stands in the Apartheid Museum, not too far from the banner print of the artwork. This connection to the South African context is important, as the artwork is often placed within a specific history of resistance to apartheid. It is also here that we find more connections about how we might place the artwork within a network of influences and tradition. Wesley Miller describes the work Caspers Full of Love and Kentridge's own inheritances as follows. Quote, Kentridge's intellectual resistance to oppression and violence through art making is a continuation of a tradition within art history, heralded by the likes of Francisco Goya. Goya's graphic, nightmarish accounts of war crimes and atrocities of war are a direct ancestor to Kentridge's gory Caspers of Love. Horrifying and vile, Goya reproduces scenes of war, rape, pillage, torture. He is a war photographer in an era before photography. Caspers of Love functions in a similar way, a reminder of what war does to a people and into what creatures regular men can mutate if allotted sufficient power. End quote. Note the description of Goya as a photographer in an era before photography, and that Caspers Full of Love operates in a similar way. What does Caspers Full of Love capture in its transposition of Force's Favorites? How are we to think about the movement of history across these mediums, that is, radio and print, and what sensorial surplus, excess, or remainder is produced in the process that tells us about the work of history? What historiographic reverberations are produced through the movement of forms? What is refashioned and borrowed? As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, I'm interested in the mediation of a radio event, a shout out in a dry point etching, a print, as an instance of transposition. It to a certain degree calls forth Richard Gruson and Jay Bolter's concept of remediation, as that which argues that, quote, the ultimate purpose of media is to transfer sense experience from one person to another, end quote, which hints at processes of memory and history that might be caught up in the functioning and reception of media itself. Remediation is an attempt to account for transposition, that dialogical correlation between what Gruson and Bolter call immediacy on the one hand, which is that which leads one either to erase or render automatic the act of representation, and on the other hand, hypermediacy, or excessive media existence and opacity, and that which acknowledges multiple acts of representation and makes them visible. Remediation is also, to a large extent, an attempt to account for the ways in which these two logics, the logics of immediacy and hypermediacy, embody a contradiction in what Gruson and Bolter call culture, and which I'm going to call modernity, embody a contradiction in modernity, a contradiction wherein there is a desire to both, quote, multiply the media of modernity and to erase all traces of mediation. Ideally, modernity wants to erase its media in the very act of multiplying them, end quote. If we turn to Kentridge, we are able to discern a hypermediacy at work through the practice of transposition for which he is well known. We see this in the transformation of objects in his work, and where these objects are associated with sound and image, there is a pervasive use of animation. Megaphones, tripods, cameras, and light bulbs are common, and in Ubu Tells the Truth, which is a production, a cat transforms into a radio. In Caspers Full of Love, however, these usual tropes of transposition are somewhat absent, with a turn towards the figure of the severed head as a structuring motif that determines the image as well as connects it to Kentridge's broader oeuvre. A rather obvious and perhaps reductive move at this point, which I make somewhat hesitantly, would be to draw attention to the fact that the ear is, for better or worse, part of the head, and that to think sound and the print would eventually lead us back to this crucial conjuncture. We might ask then whether it is the head as listening apparatus, grey matter, that is the media represented in Casper's Full of Love. It would also vindicate the assertion that it's not surprising that Kentridge should find the title Casper's Full of Love ideal and compelling as a name for the work. This is purely because the phrase received in its capacity, not as a spoken message, but as a broadcast, stresses the structure of the internal auditory meatus. It is now a transmitted message. It is equally telling that, albeit through an idiomatic turn of phrase, Kentridge guarded the name, quote, in the back of his head for a year, end quote, while searching for the appropriate image to accompany it. A closer reading of Kentridge's explanation, which I showed earlier, offers some insight into how we might attend to the work as well as its relation to the radio show Force's Favorites. In what can be called a grammatical transposition, Kentridge replaces the proper noun, Force's Favorites, that is used to name the radio program, with the common noun, a Force's Favorite. We ought to read this switch as an effort to refer to the radio message as a medium of relay between people, a calling forth of familiarity. This transposition and its implications demand to be read, in part because it reveals a kernel of that transductive potentiality that the medium of print and radio hold, but also that which the concept of remediation alerts us to. Merely through the semiotic misstep from proper to common noun, we are alerted not only to media itself, but specifically the relation between media. The public radio broadcast becomes strikingly familiar and private, belonging to the individual. This slippage is a moment at which to pause on the relation between the print and the radio. How might the slippage reflect something of the ways in which radio becomes subsumed into print? The radio shout-out to print form is not a linear movement in the ways in which the concept of remediation wants us to think about the structure of technological representation. And in Kentridge's case is a peculiar example of his work demonstrating a logic of immediacy rather than hypermediacy. The radio as form is hidden, yet marks the work. My question is, what does it mean to start from that premise in thinking about the importance of media in a history of apartheid subject formation and its concept of war? What other forms of media are hidden, subsumed, but still come to figure how we think about the history of apartheid and its effects? What does it mean in the mapping of the post-apartheid to come to search for the familiar in the public? My intention thus far was to show how remediation is both caught up in and complicated by Kentridge's work. While remediation figures Kentridge's general practice, there is, I suggest, a different logic of remediation at work in Casper's Full of Love that might require different conceptual tools to unpack, and that calls for transposition as a concept. This is an important observation, not so much for studies of Kentridge's work or the artistic sensibilities responding to apartheid, but crucial for thinking about the relationship between media, the senses, and apartheid subject. This is a question of what an approach to the senses, in this case sound, as an historiographic artifact might do to a history of apartheid. I want to move now to talk a bit about the ways in which what is mediated in Casper's Full of Love is a sonic artifact of national subject formation, the radio shout-out, that I think demands a specific language to speak of its form. The media archaeologist Patrick Feaster notes that the concept of induction emerges as a response to the failure of the now all-encompassing term of reproduction, as well as a desire to account for the technicality of phonography or the practice of manipulating early sound recording technology to produce sound. By arguing that the phonograph, and by extension all sound media technologies that would make the claim, reproduces sounds in the sense that there's a process of reiteration in the act of recording and playback, Feaster suggests that what is missed is how the phonograph represents sounds. Rather than producing a copy of the original sound, the gist of the statement to reproduce, the phonograph merely represents sound that had been inscribed into a phonograph that must be played back or educed. Instead of merely remediating or transposing the radio shout-out in the print, I want to suggest that there is the act of induction at work here as a means and practice of making sense. That is, transposing and representing the historical experience of the shout-out into the print as a dislocating of sense experience, and thus making clear the subject formation at the heart of an apartheid warring rationality. It should be stressed that Force's Favorites as a radio program and broader cultural discourse around the soldier formed part of a much larger ideological effort by the apartheid state to produce the border as a shared collective responsibility of the white citizens of the country. It is also key to portraying South Africa's military efforts as that which is essential to the protection and preservation of the state. Briefly stated, Force's Favorites offered much more than merely a relay system for communicating via the ether. One such example may be seen in the relation between Force's Favorites and the End Conscription campaign, which was a campaign to end the conscription of white men to serve in the border war. The End Conscription campaign compilation of the same name, where a parody of the radio program was a direct response to the construction of the border as part and parcel of a mythology that legitimated the militarization of the apartheid state. Force's Favorite should be thought of as a structuring motif for apartheid nationhood, against which the compilation, as well as other manifestations such as a poetry bundle, acted to undo this discursive, technical, and sensorial infrastructure. By introducing the notion of proximity and distance caught up in the notion of the border, but also in the sense that, as John Mowat has pointed out, quote, remediation is at one level precisely the structure of being in two places at once, end quote, into this discussion. We also invite a host of connections and resonances to avail themselves outside of the theoretical observations regarding radio itself, the act of radio producing a borderless closeness between soldiers and families, the print drawing influence from a Western tradition of visual representation and combining it with a very particular South African rendering of the everyday. And perhaps most striking, the fact that the print and radio might mediate the same experience of being in two realms of the social at once. In closing, to fully listen and engage with the radio apparatus was precisely to be on the border, to be neither in nor out of war. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I suggest again we give an applause. We have one more speaker before we proceed. Again, I would suggest that we ask whether anyone has a kind of more technical clarification question that Aidan could take now. Otherwise, we'll just go on and start a discussion after the next presentation. All right. In that case, I'm very happy to introduce to you Mr. Rui Assubuji, which I hope I pronounce well. He is a former doctoral and postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. His professional background is in video and photography, which he has been working on since 1985. In 2006, he completed museum and heritage studies in Cape Town, and as a PhD fellow and postdoc, he's currently still working on the theme of his dissertation submitted in 2021 with the title A Visual Struggle for Mozambique, Revisiting Narratives, Interpreting Photographs between 1850 and 1930. Today, Dr. Assubuji will speak about visual dissonances, First World War and Mozambique, a photographic exercise. Again, you can share your screen and your PowerPoint if you have one, and we are ready to listen to you. Thank you.
Good day. I'm going to start by see if I can get my PowerPoint.
To share your screen, you can push the green button at the bottom of your Zoom, and then usually there pops up multiple screens, and then you can choose.
It's not coming. For some reason, it's not coming. Yeah, share. Shows me just.
Normally, you should be licensed to share your screen. Yeah.
Share screen.
Yeah, he's a co-host.
Share. It asked
If you
me to
want-
open system preferences.
Oh,
And oh,
normally, if you click share screen at the bottom of the Zoom, it opens multiple screens that are open on your computer, and then you can pick one to share. But if you tell us what seems to be going wrong, perhaps we could give some technical assistance from here.
okay. What I'm doing here is I click on share, and then in fact, it comes, but it shows. Oh,
Perhaps your screen is hidden behind another page that's open. Maybe that could be an issue.
sorry, can you repeat?
Perhaps your screen might be hidden behind another screen that seems to be open. But again, if you could tell us what exactly appears on your screen once you try to share it, perhaps then we could help.
It's not reading. It just, because I bring the share, it shows, but it's not reading.
It shows that it's not ready.
It's not reading.
Yes, another possibility is that you would send your PowerPoint by email and then we could open and share it here.
Yeah. In
Okay.
fact, Rui, you could send it to me on WeTransfer quickly.
Yeah, that would be an option.
Okay. Apologize from this.
Don't worry, we'll fix it.
Uh,
Yeah, perhaps in the meantime, we could already take some questions for the previous speakers until Rui and Professor Hayes set up the PowerPoint. Are there any questions to the speakers of the last two presentations? We have a question here in the room.
Yeah, it's Anna Mawad, Patricia. How are you? It's great to hear your presentation. Patricia, I'm really interested in understanding, and actually, it's a provocative question. She's seeing me?
Well, I hope so. She's not appearing here on my screen, but maybe she is busy with the...
Yeah.
I do think she is here, yeah.
Yeah? Okay. But she's not seeing me.
She is not seeing you, no.
No. I can go. I
can maybe...
upstairs, yeah. Yeah. I can go there. As I did in the morning.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
It's so sad. It's so sad when you're.
I think now if you look into that camera, you can see, oh, look at that.
That's it. Yeah.
Hi, Patricia. I think this is one.
Should I say it again?
Hi, Patricia. It's good to hear you and to accompany your reflections about photography. Actually, I was wondering that your presentation challenged a little bit the autonomy of photograph as a document, even though you confirm its holes in producing evidence. So I would like to have the opportunity to listen you a little bit more about this idea of challenging this autonomy with this intertextuality perspective, that you bring the information from outside the photo, but then you take the information or from the photo to the oral tradition or the accounts made by the military that observed the event. So I don't know if I'm traveling your presentation, but I can recognize in your reflections this double side movement. You came from the photo and then you return to the photo. I also agree with the idea that when you quote Krakauer, that's an author that I am really concerned about, that the photograph is something that you have, the history have discarded. But what historians, what we do is to bring them back and try to give her monumental value. So I'd like to listen to you about this this provocative ideas. And for Aidan, it's wonderful to listen to you and it's very interesting the way you deal with this, how images, different kinds of images, travels from one support, from one media to the other media. And I have already done this with photograph and painting, from the past to the present, from the present to the future. I've been playing a little bit this perspective in my analysis. But you use a concept of remediations. And I use the concept of intermediality because I think there is a connection between this, the medias. In a way, I don't know if you know, but it's a well-known art historian, Hans Belting, when he discussed about how images jumps from one body to another body, and he works in the kind of the anthropology of image is the way you deal with body, with image, and with the media. So it's very interesting the way, and I when listen to you, recalls me his reflections. So it's a more conceptual discussion because I think your work is so well organized, so wrap up with the ideas. But I would like to ask you if you see any difference between remediation and intermediality. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I suggest Professor Hayes perhaps can answer first because she got the first question, and then we'll go to Aidan.
Thank you, Chair. And just to say that I have received Rui's slideshow now, so whenever we're ready, we can pick up with that. And he can tell me when to move the slides, but I will answer Anna Maud, first of all, thank you very much for your question, which is, as always, very perceptive. So you are asking me how I challenge the autonomy of the photograph in this case. And I take the photograph to, in a way, talk back to other accounts. So I'm making your question much cruder than you actually put it, Anna. But let me just say that I think that the way photographs, sound recordings, oral accounts which are built on memory, whether trained or not, as in the case of many African oral traditions, and written accounts, there are so many differences in the way, for example, they organize the way time and space is organized in them. And I think Aidan has opened up some really interesting questions about the sonic into image. And I suppose that what I do is I'm working very differently to Aidan in that I am respecting the stability of certain forms in the archive. And I am working with how they organize time and space. And I am working also between form and content. And I am picking out elements of content and looking at other forms which also reference the same thing. And all of these accounts, records, whatever you want to call them, documents, texts, images, interviews, they record in their own specific ways that are structured according to the medium in which they are working. And what I find very productive is, in a sense, taking those apart and looking at how far they do say certain things that I'm looking for and how far they do not. And they are all different in how they do that. I think photographs can sensitize us to a lot of these questions because they confront us with, they're very fragmentary. They are often detached from accompanying information, and they pose more questions than we can possibly resolve. And I do think this puts pressure on other accounts. And I think it's very interesting to come back to sort of rewire our question through that route. And having said all that, of course, you could work with these different forms in a variety of other ways as well. But I'm just finding it quite exciting to think about, especially in the area where I've been doing this research in Namibia, where a border was constructed in a landscape with no natural markings, shall we say. And in fact, very interestingly, that is the same border that became the border war that Aidan is referencing in his particular talk. So I'm not sure if this is directly answering you, but I'm wanting to hold on to something of the content as it is configured in each form. And the notion of the limit to me is very useful, which is why I started off my starting point being the sort of lacunary function that Didi Huberman uses very effectively in his book, Images in Spite of All, which is about those very indistinct, unstable, and partial photographs from Auschwitz that he works with, trying to understand the position of the moment in which it was taken. Fascinatingly, photographs are the only material that comes to us in the archive that actually are trapped in the present in which they were made. Of course, they continue through time and we encounter them at different times, but they are still of the moment, whereas everything else comes after a delay, where there's further processing and so on. And again, I think Krakauer's conceptualization of this is a very interesting one as the first draft of history. Anyway, this is a longer conversation. I hope we can continue it. Thank you.
We can continue it in your presentation in our seminar. Thank you, Patricia.
Great. Perhaps, Aidan, you can reply to your question, and then we'll proceed with the presentation of Rui.
Thanks for the question. Just very briefly, I mean, I haven't encountered the concept of intermediality. I mean, only in passing, and I'd be very interested to read some more, because I do think what you are hinting at, importantly, is the kind of limit of the concept of remediation, to think the problem that I'm interested in. And remediation really is a concept that wants to say that there's no such thing as new media, that in fact what we are faced with is just refashioning of old kind of forms of mediation in the current media we face. So I think it's very important, and I think it's something that I'm definitely something that I'm going to think with. I wanted to say that I find the concept of intermediality very, very interesting, because I think that I'm very interested in the forms of historical reading and interpretation that mediums permit or deny. So for me, the idea of the little bit that you've kind of given me, it strikes me as something very productive to think about how radio ends up in a print as, you know, as a form, and how one works with that. So thank you for that. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we'll continue this conversation after the presentation of Rui. If I understand it correctly, it's possible to share the screen now. I hope this is also appearing behind us. I'm just looking at the people in the back. Yes, this is perfect. Please go ahead.
Apologize. When I tried earlier, it worked, but then suddenly it asked me to go to settings, and then I don't know. I didn't know what, and then I get a little bit confused. But then I'm gonna straight jump onto my paper. Okay, transposition is understood here as a restatement of an early position in a new and broader context. An act of changing something, or of exchanging the position of directly related things, whether living subjects, objects, or thoughts, through a mediated process. Paraphrasing Byron and Verbergt, it refers to any kind of transfer resulting from relations among stimuli. We focus on analog photography and suggest that a transposition occurs when light mediated by lens penetrates the dark chamber behind it and imprint an unidimensional replica of the light source. Another transposition is the passage from negative to positive, mediated by an enlarger that projects light through a photosensitized pellicula to another photosensitized surface. The mediations would be controlled by men for the achievement of desired result. The subject of the photograph creates its object, the photograph, an image imprinted in a photosensitized milieu, mediated by a developing process, its revelation. Yet, working in photographs, we go further proposing transpositions not only from its tangible point of view, but venture to intangible aspects, from its materiality to its interpretation and meaning construction, which, we agree, it's not fixed. For the results suggests visual dissonances, a term ascribed to images that, while produced, convey specific purposes in their producers, something disrupts their initial narratives. Positions represent new understanding resulting from historical mediation. This paper is extracted from the concluding session of a chapter in my doctoral dissertation entitled Visual Struggle for Mozambique, Revisiting Narratives Interpreting Photographs, 1850-1930. The dissertation engages with a series of photographs found in various archives, whose selection intends to provide a visualization of the territorial formation of the country today. Its three major regions, South, Center, and North, were defined by historical events that occurred in different times, depicted in different ways by professional, missionary, and amateur photographers. Mediated by a backdrop of historical context, draw from multiple sources including archival documents, monographs, and newspapers, the dissertation tries to understand how photography was involved in the process of colonization and explores ways of reading photographs now brought to light long after being taken. For this discussion, we look at photographs taken during the First World War, which the dissertation considers an event that ultimately defined the northern limit of Mozambique. The Rovuma River constituted the borderline between Portuguese East Africa and the German territory of Tanganyika. Yet, the Portuguese felt a constant threat from its neighbor, since the German appetite for more territory was concretely demonstrated by the taking of Kionga, a little village on the Portuguese side at the mouth of the Rovuma River in 1894. Portugal was a neutral country when the war was declared in 1914, but to prevent potential invasion from Tanganyika, established a series of military posts along the Rovuma border. Only in 1916, allied to the Triple Entente against Germany, did Portugal set aside its neutrality. It changed from a defensive to an offensive strategy, and its first military action was the reoccupation of the Kionga Triangle. It was an easy victory, since the Germans had already abandoned that position. This encouraged further attempts to conquer territory of the northern bank of the Rovuma, crossing the river from one side to another and attacking posts along the border characterized most of the war activity in that East African battlefield. Places such as Namoto and Ngomano are associated with the most dramatic events in Portuguese military history. According to the Portuguese historian José Tello, during the First World War, almost half of the Portuguese military efforts was directed towards the empire. The larger consignments saw 19,438 men sent to Mozambique and 12,500 men to Angola. The numbers mobilized locally are not included. These were 10 times larger than the 19th century expeditions. The majority of these forces ended up participating in so-called pacification campaigns, confronting African powers that refused total submission to colonial authority, and only a small minority fought the Germans. More specifically, according to Arifs, another Portuguese researcher, Among the 50,000 men sent from Portugal to Mozambique between 1914 and 1918, about 4,000 never returned home due to sickness and combat. To the number of the European soldiers must be added the loss of 3,000 African soldiers, not including the invalids that disappeared or arrested. For the duration of the war, about 100,000 African men were successively incorporated as soldiers, porters, and assistants. Some of them were mobilized to serve in Allied British troops. This researcher speaks about improved indigenous mobilization in Mozambique during the period. Finally, in 1918, we had to improvise indigenous surgeons for the lack of European surgeons and corporals. The given titles were provisional and ceased at the end of the campaign before being legalized to not weight the budget. The unfair treatment affected not only Africans, but also the Portuguese. The top command was accused of discrimination, thus the men from the middle and privileged classes of Portuguese society were sent to the Western Front in Europe, while the uneducated and poor Portuguese men were sent to Africa and operate with conscript African soldiers. According to the testimonies of the participants, to France went politicians, writers, the literate, and non-military figures. To Mozambique went the ones that were only military or soldiers. Far away, fighting against all possible and imaginary drawbacks, fighting in silence and silently dying for the homeland. The task of most of officers became very difficult, aggravated by the variety of languages of indigenous soldiers from remote regions. These sentiments caused the occasional revolt of ordinary soldiers and involved officers. Since the matter reflected on different aspects such as maintenance, assistance, and the officers' salaries, the chain of command was affected and its structure fractured. Yet, the military accused the politicians of performing the desk politics, which completely disregarded the reality on the battlefields. Their continuous and contradictory instructions complicated the already poor army organization. Parallel to the military situation, the corruption of industry, from food to pharmaceutical products, and the production of different materials to equip the army aggravated the dramatic situation with considerable impact on the entire Portuguese society, which at the time was agitated by the recent fall of the monarchic regime and the unstable institution of a republican government. The entire conjuncture was masked by an inability to communicate this to any public. The work of the press was constrained by a censorship that eventually suppressed history. Subject to manipulation, the dramatic charge of such an event as World War I takes on the dimension of myth, suggests the Portuguese researcher Arives. Its function, he argues, goes beyond an instrument of political and ideological conflict and comprises manipulation of memory. According to him, the national ideal is achieved through a complex functionality, in which, I suggest, photography took part. This is apparent because the images seems unable to reflect most of the problems affecting the society in conflict, and particularly the situation at the remote African battlefields, where soldier amateur photographers took most of the pictures of the army at war. They are acknowledged in the illustrated newspapers that publish the photographs. Some are credited to the audiovisual army department. On the side of the gun, the act of photographing could be a given mission, and their main preoccupation seems to have been the reassurance of a Portuguese presence in the field and the celebration of great moments. In Portugal, press photographers followed the movement of the army, crossing the streets of the cities and the concentration of soldiers at departure points heading to the fronts. The professional produced conventional images inserted in articles that praised the country's engagement and capacity to sustain the war. However, photographs often offer different nuances to the stories they illustrate. In this paper, we have ascribed the term visual dissonances to images that, although produced for specific purposes that convey the producer's intention, carry something within the frame that disrupts official narratives. From an unnoticed object to an accidental present, the disrupting something can be a detail in the picture, disregarded and noticed in the flow of its indexicality, immaterial as an impression, ephemeral as it might only appear from an instant, yet it sheds light that can clarify or darken the understanding of an image, of the image. As an indication of so much left out of the frame, visual dissonances induces other images, such as the one mentally framed, that transpose viewers to other spaces out of the realm of the medium. Here's Patricia, visual dissonance 1, picture, first picture. Another one, yes. Since Portugal started, no, previous one, yes. Since Portugal started to send their men to the war fronts, the passage of the troops through the villages and cities, initially an attraction for crowds, became very common and eventually almost unnoticed. Besides a few family members of the ones departing, a certain desolation accompanied the expeditionary soldier already from home. In the image, the troop is marching through the streets of Lisbon. Somewhere in the city, the soldiers were concentrated in the barracks before they embarked on the ships at the city main harbor called the Sun Pier. Such pictures became a constant in newspapers. The photographer that fed the public with this kind of images never stopped covering the passage and departures of the expeditions. The photographs accompanied reports and comment on illustrated press such as Ilustração Portuguesa. Since the intention is to epitomize a situation that goes beyond the specificity of the image, the precise data of the picture is not unimportant for the discussion here, as its content and aesthetics, which contribute to a larger reflection on the event in which the depicted moment is inserted. According to various monographs written by officers who fought in the African battlefields, the soldiers were involved in a mission about which they had very little idea. Publicly, contradictions with the military command were several times pointed out, as were the disjunctions between the military and the politicians. The military criticized uniformed politicians whose contradictory instructions reveal their ignorance of the conditions in Africa. That is given as one of the reasons for so much improvisation that characterized the whole operation. As part of the entire conjuncture, civil society was also involved, and the country was submerged in discontent. This photograph that we see might denounce these disjunctions. In the picture, marching on the side of the column, an officer leads the men through the streets of the city. The city seems deserted. Very few civilians are seen. On the left side of the frame, as if incapable of any reaction but passive observation from a distance, one or maybe two sparse civilians are standing. On the right side of the frame, a few other civilians are also observing, but others accompany the march of the column of soldiers that partially occupies the center of the frame in a diagonal line. They march as a unit at a synchronized space. However, While the whole body of the soldiers and civilians have the same leg projected to the front as they move, the more senior military officer to the side has a different leg forward, almost imperceptible within the flow. That detail in the image is quite revealing. The Portuguese command is out of step. Visual dissonance 2. Following photograph, Patricia. In the collection of World War I, there is a few photographs of the crossing of a trestle bridge over the Rovuma River. This was considered the peak moment of the Portuguese participation in the war. Organized in 3 different columns that crossed the river in different ways and locations, the maneuver took place on the 19th of September 1916. A heavy force comprised infantry, cavalry, artillery, and communications, together with porters and engine vehicles proceeding to Germany, Tanganyika, to conquer territory that would be useful during the expected rescramble for Africa at the end of the conflict. According to Captain Moreira de Sá, the communications engineer in charge, according to Captain Moreira de Sá, the communications engineer in charge of the telegraph station, they were in full enemy territory beyond the Rovuma. With the communications cut off, they were completely isolated, and Nevala Fort, which was more than 40 kilometers distant from the nearest point at the Portuguese bank, and about 200 kilometers from the general headquarters of the expedition. The photograph seems to have been taken at the end of the crossing operation, since there are no signs of the cavalry, soldiers, or vehicles in the image. The action was realized by the third expedition sent in 1916, the biggest during the war. General Gil is the commander. He is in the picture, recognized because he appears in several other photographs of the expedition. He has a stick on his head. He was criticized for keeping himself far from the battlefield. There are 2 officers close to him in the foreground, and behind them, a line of soldiers stretched along the bridge. Further back, there are some Africans not wearing uniform, therefore not soldiers. Curiously, firearms are not visible, and everybody on the bridge is posing for the photograph. Are we looking at the ones who stayed behind? A zoom into the image exposes a detail. Please, next slide, Patricia, please. A zoom into the image exposes a detail. The last Portuguese soldier in the line can be seen in an embrace with an African woman. From the monographs written by participant soldiers, it is known that on the Mozambique front lines, the level of anarchy and improvisation allowed irregular practices of substancy, accepted as a way of surviving. Such were the huts of on the fringes of the military encampment, inhabited by soldiers who could afford it. Some huts were privately ordered and built. In other cases, the ones arriving would buy the huts of the ones departing. The transaction often comprises the hut with everything inside it, including the black servant and eventually a black woman. Some huts became social and commercial points, often selling forbidden items such as alcohol and tobacco. In what seems to be a photo opportunity, the rest of the crew gather on the stage where the peak moment of the Portuguese participation in the Great War was performed. A successful maneuver had another moment of celebration, and it was registered. In the picture, despite their number and their important contribution to the survival of the Europeans, the black men are at the back of the line, as if to confirm their fate, the last to benefit from the goods, whatever they were constituted of, the last to eat if there is food, the last to drink good water, the last to get comfort if there is any, the last to be looked after if wounded or sick, yet the first to be sent on the missions of sacrifice. Another slide, Patricia, please. Slide number 3, visual dissonance 3. In the collection, a different location of the crossing of the river is also depicted. On the emulsion of the photograph is inscribed the name of the photographer, the place where the photograph was taken, the action depicted, and the date. André Moura, na moto, Travessia do Rovuma, 1996. According to the inscription on the surface, it was taken on the 19th of September 1916. André Moura, telegrapher of the expedition, shot the photograph. There are other photographs similar to this one, such as the one that was actually published in an illustrated magazine. In that photograph, the general is on the raft, accompanied by some of his staff. They are posing for the camera. On the raft, there are also some non-uniform Africans, therefore not soldiers. Some of them are seated. A few are standing on the boards of the raft and looking at the water, as if controlling the stability of the raft. Close to the raft on the land, an African soldier is holding a horse that drinks from the river. Maybe it's the general's horse. Other photographs of this collection depict expeditionary soldiers in groups after the crossing. Similarly, they have inscribed on the surface 1916, which refers to the third expedition, the greatest sent to Mozambique by Portugal during the Great War. In Tanganyika, the Portuguese column started their advance to Navala and Massasse, which they occupied for a short period. They withdrew with great losses in terms of military equipment comprising vehicles and the heavy telegraphic station, GFC. Looking at the photograph, instead of celebrating what was considered a big moment of the Portuguese army during the war in 1916, knowledge of the past event challenges its caption and influences its reading. The effect of looking at the image is very disturbing, since it strongly resonates with the event that occurred 1 year earlier. In 1915, the soldiers of the second expedition attempted to cross the river almost in the same way, towed across the water. Struck by enemy machine guns just before reaching the German bank, many African and European soldiers died, others disappeared, and others were made prisoners. So the understanding of this image of 1916 is dominated by the feeling expressed by Roland Barthes, commenting on the photograph of Lewis Payne. I observe with horror an anterior future of which there is the stake. Now, as the photograph shows, the soldiers are alive, looking at the camera, pausing, perhaps also getting some fun out of the art of photography. Yet, in middle of the river, caught by a rain of bullets, many never reach the land. An image of anterior future, to echo Nancy Rose Hunt, transmits to the mind a constructed image of the past, and that past is assumed as the depicted present, whose future is here, under the eyes of the viewers. Those men were dead, and they were going to die. While photography complicates chronology, memory obfuscates vision. Therefore, the picture is not from the successful 1916 crossing of the Rovuma River, but from the 1915 disaster. The dimension of the war in Europe is easily perceptible from the profuse pictures of villages and cities in ruins, the corpses of soldiers and horses or mules spread half-buried in the battlefields, and the drama of the trenches. The war was brought closer and made real. The images transmit the deafening silence of the dead and the desolation of the world after the battles. Although exposed to many photographs of war, what kind of images of the expeditionary forces in France was diffused to the Portuguese society? In Africa, old cemeteries with graves of European soldiers and landmarks are landmarks of today's almost imperceptible Great War. They are monuments that barely connect Africans with the event. In Mozambique, the most representative monument to the war is located in a great square of the city formerly known as Lourenço Marques. The square was named after the French president MacMahon, who mediated the seriously disputed colonial ownership of the Lagoa Bay in favor of Portugal. After the country's independence in 1975, a new name was given to the square. In what is now Maputo City, it is called Praça dos Trabalhadores, Workers' Square, and is dedicated to Mozambican workers. Images of the war in Africa might convey the suffering of and the challenges faced by men directly involved, but they are less dramatic compared to the images from Europe. They do not display corpses of soldiers, nor cities and villages in ruins and landscape destructions. Therefore, photographs could be one of the reasons why the dimension of the Great War in Africa was considered almost unknown in Portugal. Yet, the diffusion of the carefully composed images, such as those of André Moura, suggests the depiction of the war as a photographic event. For contemporary Mozambicans, whose archives seldom incorporate photographs, and considering that very few depict specifically African soldiers, the conflict almost never happened. To conclude, this paper discusses photographs of the First World War, 1914-1918, in Mozambique, retrieved in Portuguese archives. It recurs to the concept of transposition to indicate a shift from intention to perception that occurs to the understanding of images mediated by crossing references with related historiography, documentation, information, or influences derived from other forms of media and viewers' positionality. From an overlooked object to an accidental presence, it can be a detail in the picture, disregarded or unnoticed in the flow of its indexical excess. Immaterial as an impression, even out of the realm of the image, ephemeral as it might only appear for an instant, perceptions allow different readings and influence its initial meaning. As an indication of so much left out of the frame, they shed light that clarify or obscures the understanding of historical events. So departing from concepts such as transposition and mediation, the paper's intention is to introduce the notion of visual dissonances, a concept applied to the study of photography in the history of Mozambique. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Assubuji, for this interesting talk. Thank you also to the other speakers, of course, for their presentations. I've very much enjoyed looking so closely at these photos, something I'm not really used to, but which is very inspiring. I'm sure there are questions. I see John Rouse has his hand up. Perhaps, John, you can start.
Great, thank you. Well, really a very, very interesting session. Let me direct myself first to Patricia. I thought that Anna's question was very good, you know, that as photo historians, we begin with photos. I always say that mine is an ocular standpoint epistemology. I begin with photos. I find good photos and then I work around the photos. I loved your citing Elizabeth Edwards, a wonderful, wonderful photo historian. Photos do point in direction. They give us clues. And certainly one of the things that I've learned from Elizabeth is the bias in archives. We had a real Clay Swords, I remember, in Florence, because I really didn't understand what she was talking about. In Mexico, I worked with enormous archives, 5 million negatives and stuff like that. And so I really didn't understand what she meant by bias. And it's true that's one of the places that the silences, the lacunae, the absences are. For instance, there's a wonderful study by Kevin Coleman on the way in which the United Fruit Company archives in Honduras were censored. Before the United Fruit Company gave their archives to Harvard, they took out the photos they didn't want there. In terms of the random access, yes, a lovely concept. And one of the things that I would observe about the photo you showed us was that the weapons are not interchangeable. The men had different rifles. So that would seem to indicate one of two things. I've studied a lot about the Mexican Revolution, which is 1910 to 1920. And one of the things that is interesting is that the revolutionaries have weapons are not interchangeable. That's a terrible problem when you're in the midst of combat. If you run out of ammunition, you can't use the weapons, the bullets that your fellow soldier has. So that, whereas the uniformed, the forces of repression are always carrying interchangeable weapons. If you look at those Portuguese guys marching, all those weapons are interchangeable, so you can use the bullets of your buddy. The group photo was very, very interesting, and I'm sure you know the study by James Ryan on picturing empire, where he compares a lithograph with a group photo of treaty making in Kikuyu in 1889 on page 221 of James Ryan, Picturing Empire. And it's really fabulous the way that he shows how the Africans have much more presence in the photo than in the lithograph. Finally, although you're right, certainly photos are of the moment at Krakauer, but the problem is that photographs float. Photographs only mean in context. Photographs are itinerant, so that we need to study their itinerancy, because their meanings can be completely reversed in another context. Context is meaning with photographs. Rui, what a brilliant reading of photos. I really, really enjoyed it. I would have loved to have heard less of the introduction and just heard more about, I would have liked to seen a lot more photos. And I'd love to see also these photos published, and how the photos are cropped and how the cut lines on them change their meaning. I didn't notice that officer out of step. Wow, great reading. The second one, the soldier with the woman, not only demonstrates the anarchy of the Portuguese forces, but also the race mixing. You're probably not going to find that in British photography, and certainly in the New World here in Mexico, the Spanish and the Portuguese mixed with the Indians, mixed with the blacks. The British didn't, also another point I would make is that the general is in the great man pose. He's the only guy not returning, the glance of the camera. He's looking off into history, as it were, I love the photo where that's mislabeled. You just can't trust, even when photos are written on them, you can't trust the labeling of them. And so, that's one thing that I learned when I was studying the photography of the Mexican Revolution, that you can't trust not only, the labeling when they're published, you can't even trust the labeling that appears on them, because also photographs were stolen all the time. were copied by other photographers who then changed completely their meaning and changed who made the photos, you know. So that's fabulous. And finally, when you talked about what sort of photos get, you know, we didn't hear what photos got published, but there was one big difference between the Mexican Revolution and the First World War. And that was in the First World War, photographers were censored. The generals did not want photographers around taking pictures. In the Mexican Revolution, the revolutionary leaders had much more consciousness of the importance of photography. They wanted to be photographed because they, you know, that was a way of selling themselves not only to the Mexican public, but to the United States Congress, you know, who, you know, and obviously the US was going to be determined. But hey, what a great session. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those comments. Would you like to react, Rui or Patricia?
I'll react very quickly. Thank you so much, John, for that most wide-ranging set of comments. And very quickly, I will go back to James Ryan's book and check that particular group photo you mentioned. Thank you for that. On the on the lack of interchangeable rifles, you're absolutely right. The area that we are looking at there was awash with trade from the 1850s. It was beyond the reach of the actual Atlantic slave trade. And so trade came later and it came with a big bang. And there are accounts of different traders coming from the north and from the south, bringing different kinds of weaponry. Plus, within a short space of time after that group photo was taken, there were occasions when the Portuguese officers got extremely annoyed when they saw how many Portuguese rifles many of the Kwanyama soldiers had managed to acquire from neighboring peoples who had actually defeated the Portuguese earlier. So that's a very astute point. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for the comments. It's very stimulating. You're right. I'll have to refine it more, the paper, and include more, eventually more photographs that bring out all the sorts of aspects that we are looking for. And it's a good point that of the black woman and the races. I knew that. But because I'm just sitting on the Portuguese side of that, I didn't went to, you know, like make comments from the British that actually came to fight for the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were not delivering, and there was a lot of problems, and even the British soldiers would had difficult to deal with the Portuguese European soldiers besides the Africans. So thank you very much for that. I'll pay more attention for it. Yes, the thing is that to Africa, and particularly to Mozambique, they didn't really send any journalists or photographers, press photographers. They were sent to the battlefields in Europe, France, particularly in France, where most of the Portuguese soldiers were sent to, and the famous battles of Laliz and so forth. It was too far. It would take too long. And another aspect of this far battlefields is that when the news arrived in Europe, it already past. It's already, the situation has already changed there in the battlefields. So the people were receiving information in retrospect, like, so when Portugal, Lisbon and the Portuguese were celebrating victory, eventually the victory of crossing the river, they were already dying and retiring from the positions that they got there. So all of that, and then it was not very well clarified. So it creates this kind of misperceptions of what really was going on. And yes, I'll have to work a little bit more in order to try and bring it more strongly onto the paper. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all again for joining us. We are approaching the end of this session. For anyone who would be happy to look at these pictures again, I'm happy to tell you that we are recording all sessions. So there's always an option to take a second look at these wonderful photographs that you showed us. Thank you for joining us all the way from South Africa. And I suppose we can give you all another round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.